First off, TJ, all this crap about rights is wrong. I really hate it when anarchists say things like, I have a right to this, or society should be based on consent. I have no idea. I don't know what the rights are. You don't know what the rights are. We exist in a physical world, and we can move in 3 dimensions and through time. As for rights, I have no idea what people are talking about. Do they mean words written on a piece of paper? The Constitution? Are those the rights? Okay. Rights are a non-concept, and when people say they have rights, they typically mean that they won't be punished for certain actions by everyone relevant to them. That is, you have a right to breathe because nobody will attack you for breathing. That's how I think about it. But the idea of rights as something platonic, as something that actually exists physically somehow, is a very dangerous concept because it leads to people thinking in very binary ways, as opposed to, what are the consequences of this action, which is the correct way to think. They'll go, do I have the right to do this? As if a right is anything other than a description of how other people will react to you doing something. Right? And so in its truest sense, all a definition of rights do is convert what should be a cost-benefit analysis of your actions, right? Like living life, it turns this calculation and figuring things out and doing things scientifically into a ham-handed binary view of the world. What does that have to do with what you said? Well, the first sentence in your description here, if your position as an anarchist is that people can only be ruled through consent, then there exists no means whereby those who don't consent to governance can be subjected to even the most valid and necessary of laws. That line is true, but it's very annoying. I do believe people can only be governed through consent, not as a matter of it being right in some Platonic sense, but that merely out of the interaction of individuals unfettered by archons of the mind, people cannot be governed without their consent in the purest practical sense. When someone tries to govern people without their consent, you get guerrilla wars. And so government today is based on consent. And so people consent to being pushed around by people who call themselves government because they cannot conceive of any other method and view government as legitimate. I also consent to this arrangement because there aren't enough people who want to break off with me at this point, right? I must consent to the U.S. government in the same way a murderer would have to consent to a DRO that outlawed murder. But because so many people believe in the psychotic system that you must be violently forced to pay taxes for crap you don't want, otherwise, human nature will eat itself alive, I and people like me must consent because our number is so small that we have no alternative. And maybe you can kind of see how this goes into your consent paradox. In a world of DROs, why would a murderer consent to laws forbidding murder? Well, for the same reason I submit to the U.S. government. Because murderers are such a tiny minority that they either must submit to laws against murder or else live off the grid. Or I guess they could form a DRO that allowed murder, but that would kind of go against the whole point of a DRO. But anyway, and if a murderer didn't want to consent to a DRO's laws against murder and chose to live off the grid, well then that would be that. And as I said earlier, I don't appeal to any Platonic forms that everyone must subscribe to a DRO as a matter of political philosophy. The DRO is just the model that most anarchists have gravitated to, and stateless societies in the past have always used some variation of this model. If the murderer tried to attack someone within the DRO, well then I'd imagine he'd be dealt with the same way you would deal with like a pack of wolves or a bear, because by his action the murderous man is no different than a pack of wolves or a bear. Now, here in your description you really annoyed the hell out of me when you said, if victims must consent to punish criminals, will they not consent for those who have committed even the most minor infractions to suffer the most heinous punishments? If criminals must consent to be punished, will they not refuse to consent to such punishments regardless of how deserved they may be? Okay, and TJ, all people can do is place the dots really close to each other. If you are unwilling to actually pick up the pencil and draw the line to connect the dots, then you're asking for something superhuman on part of the anarchists. And I beseech you, whenever you think of a problem like this, please make an attempt to solve it yourself. Have some intellectual energy and some goddamn creativity, because it's so easy to just flop into government will solve it, as easy as it is to flop into, God will solve this moral problem. Well, in anarchic Ireland, Iceland, and the Western United States, what happened is this scenario like never happened because people submitted to the private courts ahead of time. Like when they came into a new area, they'd form, like in the Western United States, it was called the Claims Association, right? So they had a court ahead of time, and they'd set this up. And the private courts that these things had, their only power was its reputation for providing just rulings. Its power was dependent on like other people would listen to the court and carry it out, or if the court, if someone didn't obey the rulings, then like businesses would blackball them, not give them water rights, not give them easement. There's all sorts of negative enforcement mechanisms. Like today, what you do, like one idea for a negative enforcement mechanism would be shutting off utilities, shutting off water and electricity, lowering the credit rating. There's all sorts of things you can do to get people to obey court rulings. And if they don't obey the court rulings, then you can just shut off the power line. And no, it was not mob rule, okay? It's not like the courts just always went with popular opinion, because even the mob doesn't like mob rule. And if two people have a dispute and neither party will subscribe to a court ahead of time, then this scenario could play out. You could end up with a defendant choosing a court in his favor and the prosecution choosing a court in their favor. Them saying, I'm innocent, I'm guilty, and both our courts agree. And that would mean about as much as each side calling the other a poopy head. Okay? Basically, these people chose to live off the grid. They chose to live by the law of the jungles, and I don't know what to tell them, right? Anarchy means getting your shit together because there's no mommy government, right? It means figuring things out, right? There's no rights, there's no government, so figure it out. That's what it is. But what if two people subscribed to different courts had a dispute? Well, then they would be able to resolve a dispute if they're subscribed to different courts to the extent that both courts were compatible or had arrangements with each other. Okay, would the courts be compatible? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I would bet 100 to 1 that they would be compatible for two reasons. The first reason is that courts in former anarchic societies were compatible, right? They did have agreements with each other. There was some sort of common law that permeated all legal companies. In Ireland, it was called the Tuath. In Iceland, it was called the Chieftaincy. In the West, it was called the Claims Association. So, or like in mining camps, they'd have mining law. So they were compatible in the past. Different mining companies had different mining laws, and they all made arrangements with each other. And a lot of people will say, well, how can this happen? Well, the second reason, industry standardization is the norm. Okay, why are credit cards all the same size? Why are shoe sizes universal? I know Nike's kind of weird, but why are shoe sizes generally universal? Why were the rail gauges and time zones standardized? Note, the rail gauges and time zones were standardized by the rail companies, not by government. Why can you withdraw funds from any bank at any ATM? Okay, industry standardization is the norm because it's in the best interest of all these companies to standardize, right? And why can you buy both Coke and Pepsi at just about any supermarket? And the consent paradox. Well, the consent paradox is a complete non-issue once you understand that all government and all legal and policing order is provided through consent, even the one today. Now, how did people come to consent to states in the first place? You may ask. That's a very fair question, and that's one that I didn't figure out for a very long time. But I've come to this answer, and this answer is satisfactory to me. I don't know if it'll be satisfactory to you, but the answer is religion. The first states came from religion. Okay, that's the only way they could credibly force people to pay taxes. Otherwise, everyone would just go, who's this doofus? He expects me to mail him 10% of my salary? No way. But if it was widely believed that the ruler was a god or a demigod or appointed by God, or his rule was justified by Scripture or something like that, then he could abuse people and tell them it's holy. Right? That's where the first states came from. And that's why early civilization had so many religious monuments, especially when you consider how dirt poor they were. Right? It was all to prop up the illusion. And so government is a fundamentally religious institution. And it was born of religion, and the government today, the secular government we have today, is just a product of habit and inertia. When people didn't have the answers to questions, right, they asked God. when they couldn't figure out how to plan society, what they did is they picked some guy and said he was connected to God somehow, and this leader was to channel the will of God that would plan the optimal societies, right? That's why so many of like the first leaders were also held the title of chief priest or something like that, right? Because that's the origin of the state. When people don't have answers to a scientific question, they'll often appeal to God for the answer. This is the God of the gaps, and it is a non-answer that has prevented the search for real answers for a very long time. And when people don't have answers to an economic question, they'll often appeal to government for the answer. This is the government of the gaps, and it is a non-answer that has prevented the search for real answers. And so government is a lot like God, which makes a lot of sense because its origin is religious.